I'm a third generation Washingtonian. My great-grandfather, Richard Holmes, walked away from slavery in Virginia across the district line, and that's how the family got started here. I don't claim him as a runaway slave. I think Richard Holmes just looked to make sure nobody was looking and made his exit. My grandfather, Richard Holmes, joined the D.C. Fire Department in 1902. I'm very proud of that. And my family on my father's side has lived in this city ever since the 1850s. But we were a family like everybody else, particularly our family, because the District of Columbia was a segregated city, every bit as much as Florida, South Carolina, Mississippi, except that there were not signs that said white and colored. And so I went to segregated schools. The schools were integrated almost as I was about to graduate from high school. So my education was entirely in segregated schools in your nation's capital, which did not allow people of color even to go into restaurants and theaters downtown. That's just how primitive this city was until the late 50s. The city had a majority white population until almost 1960. But this city was kept segregated in no small part because of the mood of the country and because Southern Democrats controlled every committee, and they were going to make sure that the city reflected to the greatest extent possible their own parts of the country. I'm very fortunate, however, because although my parents were from the kinds of humble background you'd expect of African Americans of their vintage, their vintage was, of course, the Great Depression, World War II. They both had aspirations to go to college. Both were finished college and my father law school while I was a child. I remember my father saying when I was going to the first grade that he was going to the first grade. That I didn't quite understand. I thought he had finished the first grade. I have two sisters. I'm the oldest. I think what has been most fortunate for my sisters and me is that we grew up in the kind of family that too few children of color have today. A family where there's a mother and a father who are normal people who go to work every day, and where children live in neighborhoods so that you want to get an education. I mean, those kinds of things were routine in a generation where the movies didn't throw up on the screen. The kinds of people that invite our children today to disrespect themselves, you know, when you see movie stars who are thugs or who rap in profane language, then if it's on the big screen or if it's on TV, I guess that's what you're supposed to do. Well, of course, in my generation, if you grew up, you saw on the big screen people who you were told if you imitated that, you might indeed grow up to have what America had to offer. I doubted that because of the segregation in the city, but I knew one thing, that education was freedom. So I wasn't sure if I would be equal, but I knew I would be free if I did what my parents did, just kept going to school until I was able to get enough education to make it in this world, whatever this world turned out to be. 400 years of slavery and discrimination. But certainly not the government. Before the New Deal, the government had nothing to do with you even if you were starving, black, white, or indifferent. What saved the African American community, which had not only the government not on its side, but the government as the oppressor enforcing segregation against you? And here I mean the federal government, not the southern governments, the federal government enforcing it and reinforcing the southern states. So what did African Americans have? Two things: black church, and even more important, the black family. Now, the church is going to be there, but if the family disappears, one of the two pillars that will always be there for you is gone. Now, this may not seem to have much to do with government. Government has a big role to play here, reinforcing the family, making up for what the family may not be able to do, particularly if they're single mothers. There are lots that people like me in Congress fight for in that regard. But I don't pretend to my community that anybody can replace their own families. It does seem to me, though, that the Hispanic community and the African American community finally have produced extraordinary role models. You can even find yourself an athlete, believe it or not, because they have been some of the worst offenders, or a movie star to admire who hadn't done something that is antisocial. You really can find some. That sometimes is difficult because the ones that get the most the publicity sometimes are those who have done things that we're not very proud of. But it does seem to me that kids today do have a choice. And it's possible to admire how somebody plays football, basketball, or baseball without imitating his lifestyle, particularly when we see that while there may not be consequences for him, there's consequences for everybody in your neighborhood that tries that. Anybody in your neighborhood that tries a date rape on a girl will or should be prosecuted. If they catch him, anybody in your neighborhood who starts a fight is likely to be, if they catch him, is likely to come up on assault. And a record for a kid, especially if it escalates into a felony record, is the kiss of not death, but of exit from the workplace very often, because there are plenty of people to hire who don't have felony records. Example, one of my committees, the Government Reform Committee, is responsible for the hearings that brought the baseball players who have been using steroids before us. And as a result of those hearings, we now, for the first time, have baseball going after people who cheat. Imagine, when you think of the great heroes of baseball, that there are some of the best hitters today who have a terrible cloud over them or who we know cheated. I wonder if young people think about how they admired those people. But you know what? I don't blame them at all. The owners, the sponsors, overlooked what everybody could see, that the players had somehow bulked up. My God, how big and wonderful he's become. So what did that do? That sent young people off, some of them looking for some steroids themselves, because if that's what it does to you and it makes you look so good and then you can hit like that. Finally, this Congress, which should have done it at least 10 years ago, baseball, who would still not do it if we had not exposed them through our committee, and the union, who simply believed their role was to do whatever the players desired instead of play a leadership role with their own players. And here I'm speaking as a real union person. Seems to me all of them were in cahoots and collusion. Among those who paid the price are very young people who then went on steroids, and I'm hoping we can pull that back before it becomes as widely used and abused as drugs have become among young people. I have a perhaps special role in Congress because the people I represent don't have the same political rights that everyone else has because they lived in the nation's capital. Congress has asserted a role over them that it does not and cannot assert over any other people. Gradually, the District of Columbia, your nation's capital, has gotten the right to govern itself. That wasn't the case when I was a kid in elementary school. The city was ruled from Congress by 3 commissioners who were nominated from Congress to sit in judgment over the city as if they were mayors or some kind of city council. NAD has a mayor and a city council. It got what is called a delegate to Congress. That's what I am, only in 1970, and that is someone who fully represents the city, is a, quote, member of Congress, no question about that. But I can't do the final vote on the House floor, although I vote in committees and have every other privilege of the House. But there's no representation whatsoever in the Senate. This began in a process that it was rooted in race. Although the district was not a majority black city, literally, until 1960. Because of its proximity to southern states, such as Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland that had segregation, it was a Jim Crow city. And blacks could more easily come here than they could go further north. So it always had a large complement of blacks. Where you had Southern Democrats, determinedly racist, the notion of having a critical mass of blacks was enough to keep all the white people from getting their rights too. So I say to my friends, we brought you all down with us, even though you were the majority. Now we have cured some of that, but what an outrage it is that the residents of the District of Columbia still do not have their full rights. We still don't have those 2 senators. We still don't have a full voting member of the Congress, even though ever since the creation of the Republic, residents of this city have fought and died in every war our country has indeed fought, paid federal income taxes to a government that does not give us equal rights, otherwise known as taxation without representation. You have taxation without representation here because although we're second per capita among all the 50 states in the District of Columbia in taxes paid per capita to our government, our folks still don't have full voting rights in this chamber of which I am a member. I have in my office a young man who is in the tradition of African American residents who fought in all our wars, who was on the front lines in the Iraqi war, and who came back home and was here when the first Iraqis went to the polls. And here's a young man who risked his life and was pleased to do so. And yet he comes back home, and though he can himself vote, he does not have the same rights that an Iraqi would have, the right to vote for someone who can vote on every issue that comes before the Congress, including whether or how much to pay taxes and whether to go to war. That is one of the great scars on the American Republic that's still there, and it is perhaps at the very top of my mission in Congress.